The bus groaned to a stop at the edge of Maple Ridge, and the doors opened onto a wall of cold that Hannah Collins had not expected. She stepped down with one suitcase, its handle wrapped in tape, and felt the wind cut through her coat like it had personal business with her. In her pocket, she carried $8.17, a folded newspaper clipping gone soft at the creases, and a grief so large it had learned to make itself small enough to fit inside her chest without splitting her open. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood at a graveside in a town 200 miles from here and watched the only family she had ever known disappear into the ground. Her mother had been sick for a long time, long enough that Hannah had learned to love her in the past tense before she was even gone. When it was over, there was nothing left to hold on to except a small apartment she couldn't afford alone and a silence that rang louder than any noise. The clipping had come from a diner bulletin board. Caretaker wanted, isolated farm, room and board, ask for Jacob Turner. She had read it 3 times before she understood that she wasn't looking for a job so much as she was looking for a reason to keep walking forward. She believed she was answering an advertisement. She did not yet know that 4 children on a snowbound farm had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone exactly like her. The farmhouse sat alone at the end of a long dirt road, gray sky pressing down on a gray roof, as if the whole property had agreed to stop trying. The porch sagged in the middle like a held breath. The windows were furred with dust. There should have been smoke curling from the chimney, the sound of children somewhere, a dog barking, anything. Instead, there was only wind moving through bare branches, and even the wind sounded like it was lonely for something it couldn't name. 2 years earlier, Laughter had lived in that house. Then, Jacob Turner's wife had died pulling their youngest son from a frozen pond, giving the last of her strength so that his small lungs could keep working after hers had stopped. Since that day, Jacob had not so much lived as endured. He rose before dawn, worked until his hands went numb, and fell into bed too exhausted to dream, which was, in its own way, a mercy. He blamed himself every single sunrise, as though grief were a debt he alone was responsible for paying. His children had learned to carry their sorrow quietly, the way children do when they sense their father has no room left for theirs. Emily, 14, had traded her childhood for the role of second mother, learning to braid hair and burn dinner and pretend she wasn't scared. Noah, 11, slipped out before school to do chores no one had asked him to do, certain in private logic of boys that age that if he worked hard enough, his father wouldn't have to carry the farm alone. Grace, 8, had a smile that only appeared when she was asleep, as if joy had become something she could only afford to feel unconscious. And Mason, the youngest, the reason his mother had died, had not spoken a single word in over 2 years. He had watched, from a hospital hallway, too young to understand what dying meant. Doctors moved too slowly to save the person he loved most. After that night, he simply stopped talking, as though words themselves had become something too dangerous to trust. When Hannah knocked on the door that first afternoon, Jacob answered with the flat, tired eyes of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to hope for anything good. He looked at her suitcase, her thin coat, the exhaustion under her eyes that matched his own, and something in him recognized a fellow traveler in sorrow. He hired her before he'd finished the sentence asking if she had references. She never asked the children to love her. She never told them everything would be okay, because she had learned, standing over her own mother's grave, that some wounds do not close just because someone wishes them to. Instead, she made soup on the coldest nights and left the pot simmering long after everyone else had gone to bed, so the kitchen would smell like something other than absence in the morning. She found Noah's coat with its lining torn out from crawling under fences and mended it by lamplight without saying a word about where he'd been at 5 in the morning. She tucked small handwritten notes into school lunches. "You are braver than you know. Today is going to surprise you," and never once asked if they'd been read.
She remembered that Grace's birthday had passed unnoticed the year before, and quietly, without ceremony, she remembered it this time, with a cake that leaned slightly to one side and candles that Grace blew out with her eyes shining, unsure of what to do with being noticed. And Mason, she never pushed him to speak. She simply sat near him, not too close, while he arranged rocks into careful lines on the windowsill, and she let her presence be the only conversation, patient as weather. Some evenings she read aloud from books she found in the attic, her voice low and steady, never once turning to see if he was listening, because she understood that being watched was the fastest way to make a frightened child disappear back into himself. Little by little, the house began to remember what it sounded like to be lived in. Emily stopped flinching when asked to just be 14 for an evening. Noah slept past dawn for the first time in longer than he could remember. Grace's daytime smiles started arriving uninvited, the way real ones do. Jacob, catching himself laughing at something Hannah said while she flower dusted. The counter looked almost frightened by the sound of his own joy, like it belonged to someone else's life. Hannah never asked for anything in return. She hadn't come to replace anyone, she had only come to stay, which turned out to be the one thing the house had needed all along. Months slid by the way winter does in farm country, one gray day dissolving into the next, until spring arrived almost without announcement, and the fields around the farmhouse turned green again for the first time since before the accident. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, flour on her hands, the radio humming low, that Hannah swayed on her feet, reached for the counter, and folded to the kitchen floor before anyone could catch her. Jacob found her there minutes later, and the sound he made, somewhere between her name and a prayer, brought the children running. At the hospital, after tests and hushed conversations behind a curtain, a doctor told Jacob what Hannah had been carrying, silently for months, a heart condition, serious, worsening, the kind that does not forgive delay. She had known before she ever stepped off that bus in Maple Ridge. She had chosen not to say anything because she had watched what losing a mother does to children, and she could not bear to hand them another loss before she had to. So she had stayed, tending a house full of grieving strangers who slowly became hers, while her own heart, quietly, faithfully, began to fail her. She recovered enough to go home, though not enough to pretend the sickness wasn't there. She grew paler through the summer, tired more easily, though she never let the children see her rest longer than a moment before rising again to hang laundry, or braid Grace's hair, or sit with Mason among his careful rows of stones. Then, in the first hard freeze of the following winter, a storm rolled down out of the hills and sealed the farmhouse in white. The power flickered, the windows rattled, and in the middle of that howling night, Hannah collapsed in the hallway, her breath catching, her hand reaching for a wall that wasn't close enough. Jacob carried her to the truck himself, snow swallowing his boots to the ankle, and drove through a storm that should have stopped him, one hand on the wheel and the other locked around her fingers the entire way, as though letting go might be the thing that took her from him. The children rode in the back seat in a silence heavier than any storm outside, Emily holding Grace, Noah staring at nothing, and Mason pressed against the window, watching the snow fly past like static, saying nothing at all.
At the hospital, the doors swallowed Hannah, and a nurse gently pulled Jacob back before he could follow her any further. The children cried in the waiting room harder than they had at their own mother's funeral, because grief, it turned out, does not measure itself by how long you've loved someone, only by how much you stand to lose. Machines beeped somewhere behind closed doors. Minutes stretched into something that no longer resembled time. Nurses hurried past with their eyes down. Doctors spoke to each other in a low, clipped language none of the children understood, and understood completely anyway. Mason stood apart from his siblings, very still, very small against the wide hospital hallway, his eyes fixed on the doors that had taken Hannah away. A nurse stepped out just long enough to say, gently, to no one and everyone, "We're doing everything we can," and disappeared again before the words had finished landing. That was when Mason moved. He walked, slow and deliberate, past his father, past his sisters, past the nurse's station, until he was standing directly in front of those closed doors, closer than any child should have been allowed to stand. Jacob rose to pull him back, and stopped, because something in his son's face told him not to. Mason's lips parted. For the first time in over 2 years, a sound came out of him that was not a cry or a whimper, but a voice, small and cracked from disuse, rusted with 2 years of silence, and utterly, unmistakably clear. "Please, don't let her die too." The hallway went still. A nurse froze mid-step. A doctor passing with a chart in hand turned his head. Somewhere, a monitor kept beeping, indifferent to the moment it had just witnessed, while everything human in that hallway stopped to absorb what had just happened. A boy who had not spoken since he watched his mother die had just spoken again to keep another mother from dying too. Jacob dropped to his knees in the middle of the hallway and wept the way men are told not to, the way that comes only once or twice in a life, ugly and open and unstoppable. Emily pulled Grace and Noah into her arms, and the three of them cried together, not from fear now, but from something that had cracked open beside it. Hope, sharp and painful, the way hope often is when it returns after a long absence.
The surgery lasted for hours. The family sat together in plastic chairs that had gone cold hours before, none of them speaking, all of them praying in whatever language grief teaches a person to pray in. Mason sat closest to the doors, his small hand resting on his father's knee, as though his voice had used up all his courage and he needed to save the rest of himself for whatever came next. When the doors finally opened, the surgeon looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who has spent hours fighting for a life, his mask pulled down, his eyes rimmed red. For one unbearable second, nobody breathed. Then he smiled, and the smile broke through the exhaustion like light through storm clouds. She made it! The words spread through the hallway before anyone had fully understood it. Relief, disbelief, joy arriving too fast to hold. And Mason, who had waited 2 years to speak again, did not wait even a moment longer to move. He ran past the nurses, past the surgeon, straight to the recovery room doors, and when they let him through to stand beside her bed, he did not call her Miss Hannah. He did not use her name at all. He looked at her, pale and tired and alive, and said the one word that had been waiting inside him far longer than anyone had known. "Mom." Jacob broke down again, differently this time. Emily cried into Noah's shoulder. Grace cried, holding her father's hand, and the surgeon, standing quietly in the doorway with his hand still on the frame, wiped his eyes before he stepped back out, because even those who see suffering every day are not immune to witnessing a miracle. Some people are born into a family, and some become one by choosing to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. Hannah had not given birth to a single one of those children. She had arrived on a bus with nothing but grief and $8, looking for work, and had found instead 4 small wounded hearts that needed exactly what she had left to give. She never replaced anyone. She never tried to. She simply loved them steadily, quietly, without asking for anything back, until a boy who had buried his voice alongside his mother found it again, not for himself, but for her. And that, in the end, was the whole of it, that the people who save us are so often the ones who arrive already carrying broken hearts of their own, and that love, given without condition, has a way of finding its way back to whoever needs it most, exactly when it's needed.